Hello, my dear masterminds. They thought they were ready. That's the part they're still trying to understand. They didn't underestimate you. They didn't ignore you. They didn't act careless or sloppy. They planned. They anticipated. They ran scenarios in their heads where you reacted emotionally, defensively, intensely, strategically. They prepared responses for anger, explanations for confusion, countermeasures for resistance. They assumed one thing without realizing it, that you would react at all. Their entire preparation depended on motion, on stimulus and response, on pressure-producing output. That's how most systems work. You apply pressure and wait for movement. You provoke and observe. You escalate and collect data. That's the loop they expected you to enter. But you didn't. And the moment you didn't respond the way the model predicted, the model failed internally, quietly. Because systems don't panic when something breaks. People do. The first thing they noticed wasn't fear, it was confusion. The kind that doesn't show on the face but disrupts timing. Conversations slowed. Follow-ups hesitated. People paused mid-thought, as if waiting for a cue that never arrived. They had prepared for reactions that signal position. Resistance means opposition. Compliance means leverage. Emotion means access. You offered none of it. You didn't resist. You didn't comply. You didn't perform calm as a tactic. You simply didn't give them what they built for. And when preparation meets emptiness, all that effort has nowhere to land. They tried again, subtle this time, adjusted tone, different angle, new pressure point, still nothing usable. That's when they realized the issue wasn't misreading you. It was that you weren't playing a role that allowed interpretation at all. Prediction requires pattern. You didn't supply one. Your response wasn't delayed to create mystery. It wasn't immediate to assert control. It arrived exactly when it needed to, stripped of excess, carrying no emotional residue they could work with. That precision creates more uncertainty than overt confrontation ever could. Confrontation confirms engagement. Silence confirms independence. They prepared for reactions because reactions create openings. You gave them an outcome without an opening. And that's the response they never accounted for. Once they realized the preparation wasn't working, they did what people always do when influence slips. They increased observation, watched for micro-expressions, read between pauses, overanalyzed tone, posture, timing. They assumed the response must be hidden somewhere, that it would surface if they watched closely enough. That assumption exposed the flaw. They believed every human response leaves residue, tells, signals. You didn't. Not because you were masking, but because there was nothing to conceal. You weren't managing an image. You weren't holding a position that required defense. You weren't waiting to see how things landed. You had already landed. That's what made their analysis useless. Analysis depends on instability. It needs fluctuation to extract meaning. You remained steady. And steadiness breaks prediction faster than chaos ever could. They tried to frame your behavior as strategy. Because strategy implies intent, they can counter. But the longer they watched, the harder that became. Strategy adapts. It adjusts when pressure changes. You didn't adjust. You remained aligned. That forced a reclassification they weren't prepared for. If this wasn't strategy, then it wasn't opposition either. And without opposition, there was nothing to apply. Their planning assumed interaction. You removed interaction without withdrawing. You stayed present, but unavailable to manipulation. That combination alters the existing structure because systems rely on response. Influence needs reaction to measure itself. Direction needs feedback to confirm momentum. You gave neither. So the structure paused, not challenged, not overturned, just paused. And most systems aren't designed for that. You held position without asserting it. And when someone holds position without announcing it, everyone else begins recalculating where they stand. That recalibration is where their confidence started to fade. Not because you intimidated them, but because their tools stopped producing results. Every framework they relied on assumed participation. Influence assumes engagement. Pressure assumes resistance. Incentives assume desire. You supplied none of it. You weren't detached. You were complete. And completeness can't be interpreted by systems built on extraction. They kept waiting for a move they could answer, a signal they could respond to, a reaction they could catalog and neutralize. It never came. Instead, what appeared was consistency. Not the rigid kind that performs discipline, but the quiet kind that doesn't fluctuate under observation. You didn't mirror energy. You didn't escalate tone. You didn't soften to be liked or harden to be respected. You stayed exact. That's when the preparation turned against them. All those scenarios they rehearsed became excess weight. Plans without a point of contact lose relevance immediately. They prepared for every possible reaction and discovered that reaction itself was the wrong assumption. Your response wasn't outside expectation. It existed beyond the framework entirely. That realization spread faster than they anticipated. Not through conversation, but through hesitation. People began checking with each other before acting, delaying decisions they would normally rush, measuring words they once used casually. Because when someone doesn't respond the way authority expects, timing slips, and timing is everything. You didn't take control, you removed their rhythm. Once rhythm fades, authority begins to sound like noise. They weren't dealing with opposition, they were dealing with an absence they couldn't fill. And that absence disrupted their preparation more effectively than confrontation ever could. That's when they realized something else they hadn't prepared for. You weren't unpredictable. Unpredictability still operates within known limits. What you introduced was something else entirely. Non-participation without disengagement. You stayed present, but declined the exchange. That placed them in the position they avoid most, acting without feedback. Every system relies on response to validate its next step. Without response, certainty erodes. They questioned whether to advance or pause. Every option felt unstable because none of them produced clarity. You weren't blocking access, you were removing reference points. Not to gain advantage, but because nothing needed to be exchanged. And reference points are how influence explains itself. You didn't argue. You didn't defend. You didn't correct assumptions. You allowed projections to remain unanswered. That's when discomfort appeared, because when response is absent, uncertainty fills the space. And uncertainty causes people to reveal intent too early. They began explaining more than necessary, committing prematurely, trying to draw something they could respond to. That's where balance shifted. Not because you changed, but because they did. Their need for response exposed itself. You remained still. And stillness under observation isn't passivity. It's placement. You weren't waiting to see what they'd do. You were watching how dependent they were on reaction. And once that dependence became visible, outcomes no longer required discussion. From there, their actions began undermining their own position. Preparation only functions when the other side behaves as expected. They kept adjusting approaches, not realizing each adjustment revealed reliance. Each shift highlighted how much they needed your response for coherence. You didn't oppose them. You didn't confront them. You allowed contrast to form naturally, and that contrast became visible to everyone paying attention. Your response wasn't silence for effect. It was completion. The kind that settles a space without announcement. They weren't interacting with restraint. They were encountering someone who didn't need to choose anymore. And that distinction was missing from every scenario they prepared. Choice suggests tension. Tension suggests leverage. You had neither. You weren't withholding, you had already moved past the point where reaction mattered. That's why their preparation looked impressive on paper and ineffective in reality. It assumed access that no longer existed. By the time that became clear, the situation had already shifted. Not through force, through alignment. They prepared for reactions because they believed reactions shape outcomes. You offered something else entirely, a settled state, and settled states don't respond to pressure. They make it irrelevant. That's when the aftermath began. Quiet, unannounced, but lasting. People stopped referring to their preparation as if it still applied. Plans don't survive contact with a reality they can't influence. They don't collapse dramatically. They fade. Conversations that once centered on control shifted toward reassessment, not because anything erupted, but because nothing landed. There was no clear mistake to point to, no obvious misstep to correct. The preparation itself was sound. The execution was clean. And yet the outcome moved past them anyway. That's what unsettled them most. An outcome without a visible cause, a shift without confrontation. They reviewed the sequence again, this time with a different lens, not looking for what you did, but for what you declined to do. Every moment they expected engagement and received steadiness, instead formed a pattern they couldn't ignore. You didn't override their preparation by thinking faster. You made it unnecessary by not entering the exchange it required. And once that realization settles in, frustration doesn't appear. Caution does. They stop assuming reactions. They stop planning around predictable behavior. Because now they understand someone in the room doesn't operate from that axis anymore. You didn't succeed by playing better. You stood where preparation no longer applied. That's the part that stays with them. Long after the moment passes, long after preparation is forgotten, they remember the realization more than the event itself. The understanding that influence doesn't always appear as action. Sometimes it appears as absence, as the refusal to provide friction where friction is required for systems to function. They prepared for reactions because reactions keep processes alive. You allowed the process to end by not feeding it. And that result doesn't invite retaliation or escalation. It invites adjustment. People modify how they approach you without ever explaining why. They choose words more carefully. They pause before applying pressure. They stop assuming access. Not because you warned them, but because they learned. They learned that not every challenge is met directly. Some are simply out of range. Your response wasn't clever, it was complete. It didn't seek advantage. It revealed that advantage had already shifted. And once that's understood, preparation loses relevance. You can't prepare for someone who isn't responding to the same signals. They accounted for every possible reaction and encountered the one condition no plan includes: someone who doesn't need to respond to remain settled. That's where everything changed, and it doesn't revert. What remains isn't tension, it's recalibration. Long after the exchange ends, people notice themselves adjusting in ways they don't fully understand. They hesitate before projecting certainty. They reconsider assumptions that once felt automatic, because somewhere in their understanding, an expectation shifted. They learned that preparation only works when both sides agree to participate in the same exchange. You didn't. And that refusal didn't come from defiance or performance. It came from internal alignment, so complete that response became optional. That's why they don't describe what happened as a loss. Loss suggests competition. This felt like discovery, an uncomfortable one. They realized that influence doesn't always come from pressure. Sometimes it comes from position so settled, it doesn't need reinforcement. They won't say it openly, but they know now. The most unsettling presence in any space isn't the loudest or the fastest. It's the one that remains still when movement is expected. The one that doesn't react when reaction is assumed. Preparation fails there. Not because it was weak, but because it was aimed at something that no longer exists. And once that understanding settles, it doesn't trigger another attempt. It alters behavior. They don't prepare harder next time. They prepare differently, with more care, with less noise, because they've learned the cost of expecting reactions from someone who no longer needs to provide them. And the lasting change is this: they stop trying to interpret you and start adjusting around you, not out of fear, out of recognition. Recognition that whatever guides your decisions isn't reactive, isn't negotiable, isn't pulled by pressure or reward. It's already resolved. That's why your response didn't look dramatic in the moment. It didn't need to be dramatic. It quietly set a new reference for what steadiness looks like when it isn't performing for approval. People adjusted their timing. Their language tightened. Their assumptions thinned out. They stopped expecting outcomes to be provoked and started respecting limits that were never announced. You didn't teach a lesson. You revealed a boundary. And boundaries that reveal themselves without force invite adjustment, not challenge. That's why nothing followed this moment. No rematch, no escalation, no attempt to reclaim direction. The situation resolved itself. Because once someone realizes their preparation depended on your response, and your response was never required, there's nothing left to prepare for. Expectations dissolve. Momentum dissipates. What remains is the quiet understanding that some people don't respond because they don't need to. They were already positioned where outcomes don't ask permission. That's the part they didn't anticipate. And it's the part that stays after that. The environment doesn't return to its previous shape. Not because you reshaped it deliberately, but because it now carries a different reference. People stop assuming reactions are guaranteed. They stop confusing composure with compliance. They stop believing preparation equals control. Something fundamental adjusts. The focus shifts from who can apply the most pressure to who remains unaffected by it. And in that quiet shift, Your presence becomes a reference without needing to be named. You aren't treated as unpredictable. You're treated as settled. There's a difference. Uncertainty invites testing. Settled presence ends it. They don't try to outmaneuver you next time. They don't rehearse new scripts. They adjust expectations before you arrive. That's the outcome they never planned for. Not a win. Not a loss. A redefinition. You didn't give them a response to analyze. You gave them a condition to adapt to. And conditions don't debate. They persist. That's why this doesn't turn into drama or retaliation. It settles into behavior, into pacing, into restraint, into silence where noise once worked. Preparation fades when it realizes it was aimed at a reality that no longer applies. What remains is the quiet recognition that the most decisive presence isn't always an answer. Sometimes it's the absence that closes the question entirely. What's rarely stated is that this shifted how they measure strength, not in theory, in behavior. They stop mistaking preparation for mastery and stop assuming anticipation equals control, because they learned something directly. Preparation only matters when it meets a receptive surface. You weren't a surface. You were a limit. And limits don't react. They define. After this, people grow quieter, around moments that matter. They listen more than they speak. They hesitate before trying to steer outcomes. Not because they fear you, but because they're more aware of themselves. Aware that reaction is a resource, and resources can be wasted. You didn't withhold response to gain advantage. You withheld it because nothing needed to be added. The moment had already resolved itself. That's the difference they carry forward. The difference between managing situations and existing in a way that settles them. They prepared for every possible reaction because they believed reactions were unavoidable. You showed them something rarer, that even expectation itself isn't guaranteed. And once that understanding arrives, it doesn't inspire imitation. It inspires restraint. People don't try to become you. They become more deliberate around those who don't need movement to remain steady. That's the effect that lasts beyond the moment. Not attention, not recognition, orientation. The environment learns where stillness holds, and it adjusts before anything has to happen. The understanding settles quietly. They stop preparing for you. Not because they surrendered, but because preparation no longer fits. You aren't a variable to account for. You're a constant others move around. That's where it concludes. No acknowledgement, no display, just a lasting change in how situations resolve when you're present. People learn that pressure doesn't draw you closer. Incentives don't redirect you. Provocation doesn't create motion. What works elsewhere simply doesn't register here. And once that's learned, behavior changes upstream, before words are chosen, before strategies are formed, before plans are set. They don't wait to see how you'll react because they already know. You won't provide what they prepared for, not because you're withholding, because there's nothing required. The moment doesn't ask for it. You aren't opposing. You aren't complying. You're settled. And settled states don't fluctuate to satisfy expectation. That's why this never escalates into spectacle. It closes itself. Quietly. Lastingly. They prepared for every possible reaction and learned the one thing preparation can't handle. Someone who doesn't need to respond to remain grounded. That's the final line they learn to read. And once they read it, the environment adjusts before you ever need to speak. Hello, my dear masterminds. They assumed you understood their rules because you never challenged them. That's how most systems misread silence. They believe compliance lives in the absence of resistance. They think if someone isn't pushing back, that person must be adapting. So they kept operating the same way. Same expectations, same hierarchies, same unspoken limits. They'd trained everyone else to accept. They spoke to you as if the framework applied. They referenced boundaries as if you recognized them. They acted with the confidence of people who believe the game is shared. What they didn't see was that following rules requires internal agreement. You never gave that. You didn't break their rules loudly. You didn't confront them directly. You simply never internalized the system they were using. You listened without submitting. You moved without aligning. You stayed present without stepping inside their structure. And because you didn't resist, they couldn't tell the difference at first. Resistance confirms the rules exist. You gave them nothing to confirm. You didn't argue their assumptions. You let those assumptions run until they exposed themselves. That's why the realization came slowly, not as a shock, but as a gradual discomfort. Things stopped working the way they expected around you. Their usual influence didn't land. Their incentives didn't pull. Their pressure didn't accelerate anything. You weren't slow. You weren't confused. You were simply not operating from the same reference points. While they were enforcing a structure, you were watching how structures lose influence when someone doesn't recognize their authority. They assumed you were inside the rules because everyone else was. They didn't consider the possibility that you were never there to begin with. Once that discomfort settled in, they started looking for explanations that didn't threaten their framework. They told themselves you were patient, that you were waiting for the right moment, that eventually you'd fall in line the way others always did. Systems depend on that belief. They assume time will do the enforcing if people don't. So they waited, expecting adaptation. What they didn't realize is that time only pressures those who accept the clock they're being measured by. You didn't. You weren't delaying compliance. You weren't preparing a counter move inside their rule set. You were operating without reference to it altogether. That's why time pressure around you felt hollow. That's why expectations lost weight the longer they were repeated. Repetition usually creates authority. Around you, repetition created exposure. Every time they restated a rule, it became clearer. It only existed because others agreed to it. You never did. You acknowledged the structure without granting it legitimacy. That distinction confused them deeply, because most power depends on unexamined consent. You examined it quietly and declined without announcement. They couldn't point to a violation. They couldn't accuse you of rebellion. You weren't breaking anything. You were bypassing it. And bypassing is far more unsettling than resistance. Resistance keeps the system intact by acknowledging it. Bypassing reveals the system as optional. That's when they began to notice how often you moved freely through spaces that constrained everyone else. How outcomes adjusted around you, without escalation. How nothing seemed to bind you the way it bound them. They still didn't name it yet, but the realization was forming. Slowly, inconsistently. And once a realization like that begins, it doesn't stop until it finishes reshaping how everything is interpreted. They started watching you more closely after that, not with suspicion, but with confusion. They expected to see a tell, a sign you were calculating how far you could push before consequences appeared. That moment never came. You didn't test limits, because limits only exist for those who acknowledge them. You didn't probe boundaries because you weren't trying to cross them. You moved as if the boundaries were already irrelevant, and that's what unsettled them. People understand defiance. They understand rebellion. Those are reactions inside the system. You didn't gain freedom by opposing their rules. You gained it by never orienting yourself around them. That's why their authority didn't register with you the way it did with others. You weren't immune. You were uninterested. And uninterested power is the hardest thing to negotiate with. The more they tried to enforce expectations, the clearer it became that enforcement only worked on those who needed permission to begin with. You didn't. You weren't waiting to be allowed. You were already moving. And as they watched this repeat across conversations, across situations, across time, the pattern became undeniable. You weren't selectively following rules. You weren't choosing which ones to obey. You were operating from a different layer entirely. One where rules are observed as behaviors people agree to, not laws of reality. That's when the realization finally locked in. You had never been following their rules. You had been following your own internal logic all along. And once that truth surfaced, there was nothing left for them to enforce. That realization didn't create confrontation. It created recalibration. They stopped issuing expectations the way they used to. Not because you pushed back, but because those expectations lost effect. The moment they reached you, you didn't absorb them. You didn't reflect them. You didn't reject them either. You let them pass through without attachment. And expectations without attachment lose influence. People rely on reaction to measure authority. When reaction disappears, authority becomes abstract. They felt that gap growing. Conversations became shorter. Instructions became suggestions. Timelines softened around you, not out of generosity, but out of recognition. Recognition that pressure no longer functioned here. You weren't defiant. You weren't compliant. You were unreachable by the mechanism itself. That's when they understood something fundamental. Rules only bind those who organize their identity around approval or consequence. You didn't. You organized yourself around coherence, around internal consistency that didn't need validation from the structure they defended. And when someone operates from coherence, systems don't confront them. Systems adapt around them. That's the quiet ending they didn't expect. No rebellion. No breakdown. Just the slow acceptance that you had never been playing the same game. They thought you were following their rules because that was the only model they understood. It took time for them to see that you weren't above the rules. You were outside them. And once that's seen clearly, it doesn't provoke resistance. It produces silence. And in that silence, the hierarchy subtly shifted. Not on paper, not in titles or declarations, but in behavior. People stopped correcting you. They stopped reminding you how things are supposed to work. They stopped assuming they could steer outcomes by invoking norms you'd never agreed to. The rules didn't disappear. They simply stopped applying in your direction, because rules only function when they're internalized. You never internalized theirs. You acknowledged their existence the way you acknowledge weather, something that happens around you, not something that defines your movement. That's why nothing dramatic had to occur for the transition to settle. No confrontation, no ultimatum, no moment of open defiance. Just a gradual recognition that enforcement without internal agreement has no traction. They realized that every attempt to bring you back inside their structure required something you didn't offer. Emotional compliance, fear of consequence, desire for approval. You gave them none of it, and without those inputs, the system had nothing to act on. What unsettled them most wasn't that you broke their rules. It was that you never relied on them. You moved freely because your actions were anchored to your own internal order. And internal order doesn't negotiate with external permission. By the time they fully understood that, the dynamic had already stabilized. You weren't resisting their framework. You had made it optional. And once a framework becomes optional, it no longer holds influence the same way. After that point, nothing they tried carried the same weight. The rules were still spoken, still referenced, still enforced on others. But around you, they lost pull. People adjusted without discussing it. They stopped expecting immediate responses. They stopped framing situations as obligations. They treated your presence as something that required a different approach, even if they couldn't explain why. Not respect in the traditional sense. Recognition, the kind that forms when repeated attempts produce no effect. You didn't earn that recognition by asserting yourself. You earned it by remaining consistent when pressure expected movement. Consistency at that level exposes how conditional most authority really is. They saw that rules only function when someone fears stepping outside them. You didn't. Not because you were reckless, but because your decisions weren't sourced from their incentives. You weren't measuring outcomes by approval or consequence. You were measuring coherence. And coherence doesn't accelerate under pressure. It waits. That waiting unsettled them more than open refusal ever could. Refusal gives something to push against. You gave them nothing. So the system adjusted quietly. Expectations shifted. Timelines softened. Enforcement redirected elsewhere. You became a steady reference point. The structure had to work around instead of through. And once a system adapts that way, it does not return to its old assumptions. You were following something deeper. And once that was recognized, the rules lost influence without anyone needing to break them. That recognition settled in fully, and with it came a quiet boundary. No one tried to test again. Not because you signaled consequences, but because they understood there were none. They could apply, that mattered. You weren't calculating how far you could go inside their limits. You weren't testing tolerance. You were operating from a place that never required permission in the first place. Once that became clear, the dynamic concluded without ceremony. People didn't argue. They didn't escalate. They adjusted. They spoke to you differently. They planned differently around you. They stopped assuming compliance and started accounting for independence. And that shift didn't come from dominance. It came from recognition. They saw that rules only hold influence when someone believes in them enough to obey. You never did. You acknowledged their existence without granting them authority over your choices. That's why nothing dramatic happened at the end. No victory, no fallout, just a silent acceptance that you were never following their rules because you were never operating within their system. You weren't above it. You weren't against it. You were simply elsewhere. And once people understand that someone is operating from elsewhere, they stop trying to direct them carefully, precisely. knowing that whatever governs you isn't something they can touch. That's where it concludes, quietly, enduringly. And what does not revert after that is perception. They don't just remember that you weren't following their rules. They stop assuming rules are universal at all. Something shifts in how they interpret authority, compliance, and control. They begin to see how much of what is obeyed is sustained by repetition, belief, and shared agreement, rather than necessity. You didn't lecture them into that awareness. You didn't force it into view. You let them arrive there on their own by never stepping into the frame they were operating inside. That's why it stays. Realizations reached without resistance don't provoke defensiveness. They install themselves quietly from that point forward. People hesitate before invoking rules as leverage. They pause before assuming alignment. They sense, even if they can't articulate it, that some individuals are guided by internal order rather than external permission. And those individuals don't need to be managed. They need to be accounted for. You didn't change the rules. You revealed their limits by not recognizing them as binding. And once that boundary is seen clearly, it doesn't unravel into confusion. It resolves into clarity. That's the settled state, not rebellion, not dominance, but a recalibration of what actually holds influence. They slowly realized you were never following their rules. What they realized next is that some people never do. What settles last is not admiration or resistance, but orientation. They stop trying to categorize you within their framework, because frameworks only work on what they can contain. You were never containable by their rules, and now they understand why. You weren't exploiting loopholes. You weren't manipulating the system. You weren't selectively obedient. You were anchored to an internal order that didn't negotiate with external permission. That's why nothing about you ever felt reactive. That's why pressure passed you without effect. They finally understood that rules function by shaping behavior through incentive, fear, or belonging. You didn't rely on any of those inputs, so the rules had nothing to attach to. Once that becomes clear, enforcement loses relevance, not loudly, quietly, consistently. People adjust expectations without discussion. They stop assuming timelines apply. They stop expecting compliance as default. They move with more care, knowing there are individuals who operate from coherence rather than constraint. You didn't break their rules. You exposed their dependence on belief. And once belief fades, authority becomes suggestion. That's where it ends. Not with rebellion, not with control, with clarity that holds. They slowly realized you were never following their rules. And in realizing that, they learned something deeper. Some people aren't governed by systems. Systems adapt around them. And this is where it finally settles as something stable. They no longer try to pull you into alignment. They stop testing boundaries. They stop waiting for you to adjust. That expectation fades because they understand now that compliance was never delayed. It was never pending. It was never part of the equation. You weren't learning their system or adapting to it. You were moving according to an internal order that did not require their permission to function. That realization does not spark conflict. It ends it. People stop investing energy where influence does not attach. They stop enforcing what does not register. They stop mistaking structure for authority. And once that happens, The relationship between you and the system stabilizes in a new way. You are no longer treated as someone who needs guidance or correction. You are treated as someone who must be considered carefully, quietly, precisely, without assumption. You did not dismantle their rules. You made them optional by never recognizing them as binding in the first place. And when something becomes optional, it stops functioning as influence. This is not dominance that needs display, not rebellion that needs noise, but independence so complete it reshapes behavior around it. They slowly realized you were never following their rules. What they understand now is that you never needed to. What remains after this is not tension or unfinished business. It is a quiet correction in how they read reality. They no longer assume compliance when someone is calm. They no longer mistake patience for acceptance. They hesitate before invoking rules, as if those rules are universal truths, because they remember how effortlessly their framework lost relevance around you. You did not oppose it. You did not submit to it. You remained outside it, long enough for its limits to become clear. That experience installs itself. They carry it forward into other rooms, other negotiations, other moments where silence appears. And this time, they pause. They check. They do not rush to assume alignment. You did not leave them with a story about you. You left them with a boundary on their assumptions. A lasting reminder that some people are guided by internal order, not external permission. And when that is the case, rules do not fall into chaos. They resolve into clarity, not a confrontation, not a victory, a recalibration so clean it never needs to be revisited. They slowly realized you were never following their rules. What they understand now is why that realization mattered. And this is where it concludes in the only way it ever could. Not with resistance, not with control, but with recognition that does not need reinforcement. They stop framing you as an exception. They stop trying to interpret you through their lens. They accept, quietly, that you were never meant to fit inside their rules because your movement was never sourced from them. You did not leave their system. You were never formed by it. That understanding settles and stays settled. People do not argue with it because there is nothing to argue against. Your consistency made the reality clear. Your calm made it stable. You did not need to prove independence. You demonstrated it by never asking permission. And once that is seen clearly, behavior adjusts on its own. Expectations fall away. Enforcement redirects. Assumptions dissolve. The system continues functioning, just not in your direction. You remain exactly where you always were, operating from an internal order that does not negotiate with external authority. They slowly realized you were never following their rules. What they understand now is that you never needed to, and that understanding stays with them. It does not require repetition. It does not require explanation. It does not invite debate. It simply remains, quiet, stable, and complete. Hello, my dear mastermind. They were tracking your patterns, every move you made, every decision you took, every path you considered. They built predictive models, ran probability assessments, mapped your most likely trajectories. They thought they had you figured out, thought they knew exactly where you were headed, thought they could see your next 10 moves before you even made them. They were confident, comfortable, certain, And that certainty was their first mistake. Because while they were busy predicting your future based on your past, you were quietly studying a completely different game. They expected you to move forward. You moved sideways. They expected you to climb the ladder they built. You found a different building. They expected you to play by the rules they established. You rewrote the entire framework. And the moment you made that move, the moment you went in a direction their models didn't account for, everything they thought they knew became obsolete. Let me tell you what they had on you. What their analysis predicted. What their assessments concluded. They studied your background, your education, your circumstances, your resources. Based on all that data, they calculated your probable path. If you came from here, you'd likely go there. If you had this degree, you'd probably pursue that career. If you faced these obstacles, you'd typically choose these solutions. Their predictions weren't random. They were based on decades of data, thousands of comparable examples, proven patterns. And for most people, those predictions would have been accurate, because most people follow predictable trajectories. Most people take the expected next step. Most people choose the logical progression. But here's what their models didn't account for. You weren't interested in being most people. You weren't motivated by what was expected. You weren't concerned with following predicted paths. You were operating from a completely different set of priorities, ones they had no framework to measure. They predicted you'd take the safe route. You chose the uncertain one. They predicted you'd follow conventional wisdom. You trusted your own knowing. They predicted you'd wait for permission. You granted yourself authority. They predicted you'd stay in your lane. You changed lanes entirely. Every single prediction they made was based on the assumption that you valued security over possibility, acceptance over authenticity, predictability over purpose, but you didn't. And that's what broke their entire system. Here's what they didn't see coming. While they were analyzing your past to predict your future, you were actively becoming someone your past couldn't predict. You weren't just changing directions. You were changing the decision-making framework itself. The person who would have taken their predicted path, that version no longer aligned with who you were becoming by the time they finished their analysis. Think about what happened in that quiet period before you made your move. They thought you were stuck, indecisive, uncertain about which of their predicted paths to take. What you were actually doing was studying options they didn't even know existed, learning skills they didn't think were relevant, building capabilities they weren't tracking, developing a vision they had no category for. You were preparing for a direction that wasn't on their map, and you did it silently, deliberately, without announcing your intentions, without seeking validation, without asking if it was the right move, because you knew. The moment you revealed your plans to people who only understood conventional paths, they would try to redirect you, question you, warn you about risks, project their limitations onto your possibilities. So you kept it internal, kept moving, kept building towards something they couldn't see yet. Then came the moment, the decision point where their predictions said you'd go left. And you went somewhere they didn't even have on their compass. Not right, not straight. Somewhere completely different. A direction they didn't predict because they didn't believe it was possible for someone with your background, your resources, your circumstances. Their entire framework was built on limitations. and you rejected the framework entirely. The disruption was immediate, not just surprise, genuine disruption. Because in their worldview, people like you don't make moves like that, don't take paths like that, don't succeed in directions like that. Their models had no precedent for it. Their data had no comparison. Their experience had no reference point. And here's the beautiful part. While they were recovering from the disruption of your first unexpected move, you were already 3 moves ahead in a game they didn't know you were playing. They tried to make sense of it, tried to find the logic in your choice, tried to fit your decision into their existing frameworks. Was it desperation? Was it rebellion? Was it luck? They needed an explanation that maintained their worldview, that kept their predictive systems intact, that allowed them to believe they still understood how success works. What they couldn't accept was the simplest truth. You just chose differently, operated from different values, played a different game entirely. And the more they tried to analyze your move, the less sense it made through their lens. Because their lens was built on conventional wisdom, traditional paths, established rules. Your move was built on personal truth, authentic desire, internal alignment. You weren't trying to beat their game. You were playing your own. And games they don't understand, they can't control, can't predict, can't influence. Now they're watching more carefully, trying to identify your new pattern, attempting to predict your next move based on this unexpected direction. But here's what they still don't understand. You're not following a pattern they can track. You're not building a trajectory they can project. Every move you make is informed by something they can't measure: internal compass, personal truth, authentic alignment, and those things don't follow predictable patterns. Let me show you the difference between their framework and yours. Their framework asks, what's the safe move? What's the expected move? What's the proven move? Your framework asks, what's the true move? What's the aligned move? What's the move that honors who I'm becoming? Completely different questions, completely different answers, completely different outcomes. They're optimizing for security. You're optimizing for authenticity. They're following maps drawn by others. You're creating your own territory. They're climbing ladders that already exist. You're building different structures entirely. And that difference, that fundamental difference in approach, is why they'll never successfully predict you. Because prediction requires pattern, and you're not interested in being a pattern. You're interested in being yourself, fully, unapologetically, unpredictably. Think about the moment you made that unexpected move. They had you going toward the corner office. You went toward creative freedom. They had you climbing corporate hierarchy. You built something independent. They had you following the prestigious path. You chose the purposeful one. They had you settling into stability by 35. You chose transformation instead. Not because you were rebelling, because you were aligning. And alignment doesn't follow their timelines. What's fascinating is how they react when their predictions fail. First, confusion. How did we miss this? Then, adjustment. Trying to recalculate based on new data. Then, more predictions. Now they'll definitely go here next. But they're making the same fundamental error again. They're assuming you'll eventually conform to a predictable pattern. They're assuming this unexpected move was an anomaly. They're assuming you'll settle into a trajectory they can track. They're wrong. Because the unexpected move wasn't the exception. It was the new standard. You're not gonna settle into predictability. You're committed to continuous alignment, which means every time they think they've figured out your new pattern, you'll already be evaluating your next true move. And here's what deeply unsettles them. Unpredictability, rooted in authenticity, is unbeatable. Because you're not trying to confuse them. You're just being real. And real doesn't follow scripts. There's power in being unpredictable this way. Not chaotic unpredictability. Strategic unpredictability. Not random decisions. Aligned decisions that happen to be unexpected. This kind of unpredictability places you beyond conventional handling. Not in a difficult way, in a sovereign way. You can't be controlled through predicted consequences, can't be influenced through anticipated outcomes, can't be redirected through projected futures, because you're not making decisions based on their predictions anyway. You're making decisions based on your truth, and truth doesn't care about probability, doesn't care about precedent. Doesn't care about what usually happens to people in your situation. Truth just is. And when you follow it, you end up in places their models never accounted for, creating outcomes their data never suggested, achieving things their framework said weren't possible. Let me tell you what they're dealing with now. A presence they can't outthink because you're not thinking like them. A player they can't outmaneuver because you're not playing their game. A person they can't predict because you're not following their logic. This isn't about being smarter, it's about being truer. And here's the shift that changes everything. The moment you stopped trying to meet their expectations, you became impossible to manage through their expectation systems. They built their careers on being able to predict people, being able to guide outcomes, being able to influence directions. Their expertise, their authority, their value, all of it depends on their ability to see what's coming and position accordingly. But you made a move they didn't see coming, and that move didn't just surprise them. It challenged their assumptions, questioned the foundations they relied on, and exposed the limits of their predictive confidence. Because if they couldn't predict you, if they couldn't guide you, if they couldn't influence your direction, then what exactly is their expertise worth? What exactly is their authority based on? This is why they're so invested in making sense of your move, in finding the pattern, in predicting what comes next. It's not just about you anymore. It's about their entire framework staying relevant. But their framework isn't relevant. Not for you. Maybe it works for people who want to follow prescribed paths, achieve conventional success, meet traditional milestones. But you're not interested in any of that. You're interested in authentic living, purpose-driven work, aligned choices. And once you choose alignment over approval, their entire system of predictions becomes background noise. Interesting, but irrelevant. Here's what they're learning about you now. Your moves aren't random. They're just operating from logic they don't have access to. Your choices aren't impulsive. They're just based on values they don't share. Your path isn't chaotic. It's just not on their map. There's perfect internal logic to everything you do. Perfect alignment with who you're becoming. Perfect coherence with what you value. They just can't see it because they're looking through the wrong lens. And you're not going to explain it to them. Not because you're being mysterious. Because explanation requires shared framework, shared values, shared understanding of what matters. And you don't share those things with people who are trying to fit you into their prediction models. You share those things with people who understand that some paths can't be predicted, only walked. Some moves can't be analyzed, only made. The freedom in this is profound. When you're no longer concerned with being predictable, you're no longer constrained by their expectations. When you're no longer trying to meet their projections, you're no longer limited by their imagination. When you're no longer following their maps, you're no longer restricted by their territories. And what they're about to discover is that every time they think they've updated their understanding of you, you've already evolved past it. Because you're not static. You're not a fixed target they can eventually figure out. You're continuously evolving, continuously aligning more deeply with truth, continuously becoming more of who you actually are, and who you actually are. That's not something they can predict, because it's not something you're performing, it's something you're discovering. And discovery doesn't follow predicted paths. Think about where you are now versus where they predicted you'd be. Different city, different career, different lifestyle, different priorities, different definition of success, all of the above. And more importantly, think about how it feels. Living in a direction you chose, not one they predicted. Following a path you created, not one they prescribed. Building a life that's authentically yours, not one that fits their models. They thought they had you figured out. Thought they knew your next 10 years. Thought they could see your ceiling, your limitations, your probable outcomes. They had you staying in the industry you started in. You switched to something they didn't see coming. They had you settling in the city where you had connections. You moved somewhere that called to you. They had you following the traditional relationship timeline. You created your own definition of partnership. They had you pursuing the promotions and raises. You pursued purpose and freedom instead. Every single prediction, wrong. Not because you were trying to prove them wrong, because you were trying to be true. And truth led you somewhere their models never accounted for, somewhere their data never suggested, somewhere their experience said wasn't possible. But you're there, living it, proving that their predictions only work for people who accept their limitations. Now they're dealing with a new problem. Every time someone else is considering an unexpected move, considering an unpredicted path, considering a direction that doesn't fit the models, you're living proof it's possible. You're evidence that their predictions aren't absolute. You're demonstration that their frameworks aren't the only way. And that's disruptive to their certainty, because once people see that the game is optional, that the rules are negotiable, that the paths are unlimited, their predictive confidence breaks down entirely. You didn't just make an unexpected move. You made a statement, not through words, through action. A statement that says, your predictions don't define my possibilities. Your models don't determine my path. Your frameworks don't limit my future. I choose based on truth, not probability. Based on alignment, not precedent. Based on authenticity, not acceptance. And that choice, that fundamental choice to operate from a different framework entirely, that's what makes you unpredictable in the most powerful way possible. They're trying to update their models now, trying to incorporate your unexpected move into their analysis, trying to predict what someone who makes moves like yours will do next. But they're still using the same flawed approach. They're still trying to predict you based on pattern, based on logic, based on data. What they don't understand is that you're not following pattern. You're following truth. And truth doesn't repeat, it reveals. Every move you make going forward will come from the same place the last one did. Internal alignment, personal truth, authentic knowing, which means every move will be exactly right for you and completely unexpected to them, because right for you and predictable to them are almost never the same thing. Right for you requires honoring your unique path. Predictable to them requires following common patterns. So what comes next? They're wondering. They're watching. They're waiting to see if you'll maintain this unexpected direction or eventually return to predictable patterns. And here's what you know that they don't. This isn't a direction you're trying to maintain. This is a way of being you've embodied. You're not following a new path. You're pathfinding. And pathfinders don't return to roads. They create them. The version of you that would have followed their predicted path. That version is no longer part of who you are. Not struggling, not hiding, not waiting to resurface. Replaced by someone who makes decisions differently, who evaluates options differently, who defines success differently, who measures fulfillment differently. This isn't a detour. This is your actual life, and their predictions about your old life have no relevance to your real one. So let them analyze. Let them predict. Let them try to figure out your next move. While they're building models, you'll be building your life. While they're tracking patterns, you'll be following truth. While they're predicting your future, you'll be creating it in real time, based on who you're becoming, not who you were, based on what aligns, not what's expected, based on what's true, not what's probable. They thought they had your next move figured out. They were wrong. They thought they could predict your path. They were wrong. They thought they understood your trajectory. They were wrong, and they'll keep being wrong. Not because you're trying to confuse them, but because you're committed to something they can't measure. Authenticity, alignment, truth. And those things don't follow predictable patterns. They create unprecedented paths. Welcome to being unpredictable in the most powerful way possible. Welcome to being authentic in a world of predictions. Welcome to being free.